This land is my home, my birthright. The wind and rain are my allies. The trees and stones are my foot soldiers. The very earth will rise up against you, should you try to take it from me. And my people will feast on your bones. Manfred von CARSTEIN, known in his younger years as Manfred the Acolyte, is the most cunning and magically gifted vampire of all of the von CARSTEIN bloodline. He claims the hereditary title as the Vampire Count of Sylvania, a title that is only given to the first of his bloodline. Imbued with staggering magical power, Manfred von CARSTEIN has managed, through sheer ambition and willpower, to accumulate all the spells from the Lord of the Vampires and the Lord of Necromancy after spending the better part of a century collecting the forbidden knowledge from the sand-encrusted libraries of ancient Nehekara. Like many of his vampiric kind, he has led the armies of Sylvania to war on many occasions, his mastery of the necromantic arts sustaining his army far beyond their normal potential. In addition to his necromantic abilities, he is also a highly skilled swordsman. In battle, Manfred carries his ancient sword, Geistfor, a powerful two-handed weapon that allows the bearer to absorb and drink the blood of the slain, giving him the ability to rejuvenate himself while amplifying his control over the winds of magic. He also wears the armor of Tempelhof, an ancient battle armor that protects the bearer from harm and further enhances his already extraordinary endurance. Befitting a lord of his status, Manfred von CARSTEIN is an extremely cunning politician. He knows full well the extent and complexity of his position as Vampire Count. For although he claims dominion from all the von CARSTEINs, he knows that each of his subjects are far too fiercely independent to properly control. Thus, he needs to be a cunning creature as well as a warrior, using bribery, assassination, and diplomacy rather than outright conquest to secure the allegiance of his many rebellious subjects. This combination of magic, cunning, and martial skill makes Manfred a foe that will continue to leave a nightmarish mark upon the annals of the Empire's history for many years to come. Manfred von CARSTEIN was sired by Vlad von CARSTEIN in the days before his arrival at Drakenhof Castle and his marriage to the Count's daughter, Isabella von Drac. Out of all the vampires of the first bloodline, Manfred held a greater claim to his sire's throne than any other contender, but chose to remain in the shadows, letting the other claimants destroy themselves before he assumed full control of Sylvania. During Vlad's invasion of the Empire, he helped his war effort by destroying the ruling family of Nuln in a single night's blood feast. After his mission was accomplished, he felt that his time of servitude to Vlad was done. He sent the young vampire John Skellan to return to Sylvania, where he would serve as Manfred's agent in stoking the raging paranoia of Manfred's blood brother, Conrad von CARSTEIN. When asked why he did not simply betray Conrad and seize power for himself, He did not reveal his intentions. Instead, he simply reminded Jon Scalan that should he attempt to usurp power for himself, the next von CARSTEIN he would face would be MANNFRED himself. By this time, MANNFRED had decided that he could not live in the shadow of Vlad any longer, and plotted to aid in his assassination. He wanted the power of the Vampire Count for himself, but he knew that he wasn't strong enough to challenge Vlad in combat. He informed the Grand Theatonist Wilhelm III about the secret of the Count's immortality. The priest then set out an elaborate trap to catch the best thief of this very age, Felix Mann. When they finally caught him robbing the Imperial counting house, they gave him a simple choice: rob Vlad von CARSTEIN's signet ring or be hanged for his crimes. His reward for the theft would be payment enough to start a living elsewhere. Felix accepted the theft, and with a little aid from MANNFRED, robbed the Count of his most precious belonging. When the Count awakened to find his ring missing, his anger was uncontrollable. In one frantic attack, Vlad threw everything he had against Altdorf. There on the battlements, he confronted Wilhelm III and eventually overcame him. However, with his last breath, the Grand Theatonist threw himself against the undead Count, and both fell off the city walls. While the fall wouldn't have killed a vampire as powerful as Vlad, they both fell on a wooden stake, the vampire trapped beneath the corpse of the holy man. With the death of Vlad, his army dissolved and the Altdorfers rejoiced, for the horrors of the First Vampire War were finally over. In the immediate aftermath, Felix Mann, wanting to claim his reward, discovered that with no physical proof of the deal he had with the Grand Theatonist, nobody would believe he had committed a theft on behalf of a holy man. Wronged and angered, Felix stole one of Vlad's books of Nagash. However, while fleeing from the Sigmarites, he became conscious that someone was following him from the shadows. When he was finally cornered by the stranger in a back alley, he tried to buy him off with the dead Count's signet ring. The stranger, who was, in fact, MANNFRED von CARSTEIN, severed both wrists of the thief, took the ring and the book, and left Felix for dead. With his mission accomplished, MANNFRED journeyed south to Nehekara, wandering Kemri and the other dead cities, where he procured much necromantic lore from the stolen books of the Gash and the few tomb kings willing to deal with him. In time, he became more powerful in his magical abilities than Vlad von CARSTEIN had ever been. With the death of Conrad during the Second Vampire War, the last contender for Vlad's position was MANNFRED von CARSTEIN. Whilst Vlad was the most powerful, and Conrad was the most violent and bloodthirsty, he was by far the most cunning and magically gifted of the entire bloodline. By the time MANNFRED returned to Castle Drakenholm to acquire and cement his claim as the new Vampire Count, he soon possessed an entire library of dark lore. With the last of the First von CARSTEIN bloodline dead, MANNFRED became the undisputed ruler of Sylvania. For a full decade afterwards, he bided his time wisely and allowed the Imperial contenders to believe that the threat posed by Sylvania was truly over. Where Vlad ruled through his iron will and raw power, and Conrad reigned with fear, MANNFRED used his necromantic powers and devious manipulations to forge his new undead armies. He sought out vampires from beyond the borders of Sylvania and bribed, coerced, and flattered them into joining his new retinue. He spent many long months in the wilderness of the Empire, rousing spirits and wights from their decrepit tombs. When a vicious civil war once again racked the Empire, he deemed it was time to finally strike. His undead legions crossed the Sylvanian border in the depths of winter, as the cold does little harm to the flesh of the dead. With the summer campaigning season over, the armies of the Elector Counts were already disbanded and wholly unprepared for the sudden assault. MANNFRED's armies marched through the snow towards Altdorf, putting to the sword any living man they met and raising the corpses to swell the ranks of his horde. In the infamous Winter War of 2132, he defeated several hastily assembled Imperial armies that attempted to block his path. Victory followed victory, and soon the dark rumor of his coming was enough to send villagers fleeing from their homes only to freeze to death in the snow. When MANNFRED's massive legions reached Altdorf, they found the city seemingly undefended. Triumph filled him. He looked set to become not a vampire count, but a vampire emperor, achieving what both Vlad and Conrad had failed to do. Then, the Grand Theogenist, Kurt III, appeared on the battlements of the city. The Sigmarite High Priest had brought forth the evil Liber Mortis from the deepest locked vaults of his temple, and he began to recite the great spell of unbinding from its pages. As the incantation continued, MANNFRED's power over his minions began to weaken. Seeing his followers crumbling to dust, he ordered a hasty retreat, for the hidden Imperial armies within Altdorf were mobilizing for a massive counterattack. Undeterred, MANNFRED marched his army along the River Reich, downstream and into the port city of Marienburg, capturing several large vessels along the way and manning them with the raised corpses of their crews. His initial plan was to lay siege to the port city and then sail his zombie fleet through Marienburg's primary rivers and canals that split the city in half and attack from the river ports. In desperation, the entire city was roused to the defense, and in time, the first undead assault upon the ports was repulsed. Unable to make a beachhead within the riverways, MANNFRED began construction of a massive siege tower and catapults within the outskirts of the city. However, scouts had reported to him that a massive Imperial army was hounding them all the way from the city of Altdorf. Realizing he couldn't win this siege, he promptly retreated. And so began a long cat and mouse chase that encircled the entire empire of man, with neither side entirely sure which one was the cat. At Horstenbad, the army of Ostermark was able to surround and ambush Mannfred as his army wound its way along the forest road, destroying nearly half of his forces. Yet Mannfred escaped the slaughter, and within the month had seized the town of Felf and created a new army. On and on the campaign raged, with neither side able to secure the ultimate victory. Twice Mannfred was forced to retreat to Sylvania in order to escape pursuit from his relentless enemies. Determined not to make the same mistakes as they had before, the nobility of the Empire had sworn a truce among themselves to finally rid the Empire of Man of the vampire threat once and for all. United under a righteous cause, the entire military might of the Empire was brought to bear, with forces being mustered from all the grand provinces for the Sylvanian campaign. To settle past grudges, the High King of the Dwarves had also sent in armies of heavily armored warriors into the fighting. Wave after wave of Imperial armies streamed into the Sylvanian borders like a massive flood, and soon the relentless Imperials had forced Mannfred into a pitched battle known famously as the Battle of Helfen. The Count's army was vast, his necromantic power having raised a legion of zombies from the muddy depths of Helfen itself. His unliving host continued to retreat deeper into the swamps, drawing the exhausted Imperial armies onwards into the filth and gloom. Yet Mannfred had not accounted for the determination of his foes. Tirelessly, the Imperial and Dwarven armies hounded him like bloodthirsty wolves until finally he was brought into battle at the eastern reach of the marshlands, where the warriors of the Empire and the dwarfs fought with grim resolve. The Vampire Count saw that victory was beyond him and attempted to flee. Elector Count Martin of Sturland, mounted upon a majestic griffon, gave chase and caught Mannfred at the very edge of the swamps. Though the Elector Count was wounded badly, his runefang cleaved great gouges into Mannfred's flesh, and the vampire's mangled corpse sank into the depths of the swamp. Despite a long search, neither man nor dwarf ever located Mannfred's body. Thus ended the reign of Mannfred, the last of the von CARSTEINs and the final end of the Vampire Wars once and for all. I urge your holiness to alert His Majesty the Emperor to the danger. If I am right, we are all in dire peril, and it will be only a matter of time before the armies of the vile undead strike west against Sturland and Ostland, as they did 300 years ago. From Witch Hunter Captain Gunther Stahlberg, in a letter to the Grand Theogenist written while in Sylvania. My Lord von CARSTEIN, we recovered this letter before it could reach the safety of Sturland. I felt that your lordship would find it amusing. Writing found in the previously quoted letter. Although Mannfred truly died upon the Battle of Helfen, an odd turn of events came about that returned him from the grave. A necromancer by the name of Stillman, a former member of the Necromancer Order of the Charnel Congress, attempted to resurrect him as an act of revenge for his banishment. Just as the necromancer was about to sacrifice an innocent soul for his ritual, Stillman was suddenly killed by a pursuing group of hunters, of which included the famous duo Gotrek and Felix. As the hunting party foolishly left his body intact instead of burning it, the blood of the necromancer dripped loosely from his corpse and flowed into the roots of a tree from which MANNFRED's body laid. With enough blood entering his body, MANNFRED was able to rise once more. He was hell-bent on taking the imperial throne for himself and ruling over the old world, even if it took an eternity to do so. Ever since, he has bided his time. Over the years leading up to his re-emergence, he traveled far and wide to secure allies. His studies with the disciples of Nagash in the ruins of Lahmia completed, his magical abilities had never been stronger. Yet the von CARSTEIN's plans were ambitious indeed. In return for their secrets, MANNFRED had sworn a dread pact with the corrupted Wraith wizards that yet served Nagash in the south. A pact to aid them in their goal of summoning the great necromancer once more and bringing a new order to the world. The von CARSTEINs had secretly been working towards this same goal for centuries following the death of the rebellious Vlad von CARSTEIN, whom personally betrayed Nagash when he invaded the Empire during the reign of Emperor Sigma and had tried to stop this summoning ever since. Though great progress had been made, their efforts had ultimately fallen short, for in truth, Nagash had become more like a god than a man, and his spirit was beyond even the abilities of the vampire counts to bring to the mortal realm. It would take the rituals of ancient Nehekara combined with the sacrifice of a powerful and innocent soul to achieve a true resurrection. MANNFRED, in his genius, saw a way to hasten the return of Nagash and seriously weaken those who would stand against him in one stroke. He enlisted Heinrich Kemmler and his servant Krell to aid him. When Aliathra, the princess of the High Elves, went on a diplomatic trip to increase relations between dwarves and High Elves, Kemmler manipulated tribes of orcs and goblins into attacking the fortress. When the elves and dwarves defeated the greenskins, Kemmler raised the corpses of the fallen and sent his own army after them. The two armies were decimated, with Thane Ogrim slain and the bodies of the defenders shambling after Kemmler as his new servants. The lover of Aliathra, Prince Eluthian, was badly injured by MANNFRED himself during an aerial battle, and Aliathra was knocked out and taken into the claws of a Terrorgeist. She was taken far from the lands of the dwarves into the heart of Sylvania, where she was locked away while MANNFRED prepared a resurrection ritual. He expected the dwarves and high elves to go to war, thinking they'd blame each other. Indeed, nobles in Ulthuan and dwarf Longbeards called for war to redeem their honor. However, Phoenix King Finubard and High King Thorgrim Grudgebearer were determined to avoid another fruitless war. Finubard was a diplomat at heart and knew that the dwarves were an honorable race, and as the keeper of the Book of Grudges, Thorgrim knew when a grudge was warranted and when it wasn't. Alariel the Radiant of the High Elves sensed that Aliathra was still alive, and thus she called upon her past and present lovers, Finnubar and Tyrion respectively, to get her daughter back. Finnubar immediately went to the dwarves to secure an alliance against the vampires, and Tyrion gathered a glorious all-cavalry army to ride against MANNFRED. MANNFRED himself was preparing to sacrifice Aliathra to complete a futile resurrection ritual. Then, Tyrion broke into his fortress of Nagashizar, found the unresponsive princess, and rode out with her. As his men were leaving, they witnessed an enormous undead army rising up out of the ground from all directions as far as the eye could see. Tyrion led the elves as they tried to fight their way out before some unexpected help came. High King Thorgrim cared little about the elves' well-being, but since it was a matter of honor, he gathered an army and followed MANNFRED all the way to Nagashizar. The dwarves hit the rear of his army just as the elves hit the front. They killed the necromancers that kept bringing back the undead, but MANNFRED recaptured Aliathra when Tyrion was distracted and used his magic to flee with her. Tyrion, distraught by this, blamed Thorgrim for their failures in rescuing the elven princess. In a surprising show of tolerance and peacekeeping, Thorgrim stood his ground, knowing that his people held the moral ground in this confrontation, and to rekindle the War of the Beards would have led to only more misery. Instead, the High King told Tyrion that the next time he tried to rescue Aliathra, the dwarves would not be there to aid them, and soon marched off with his army towards Karak 8 Peaks. Kill them, my slaves. From Manfred von CARSTEIN. At some point after his resurrection, Manfred allied himself with the newly risen Dread King, a former Dark Lord of Nagash. The Vampire Lord began a mining operation underneath Drakenhove in search of warpstone for his master. However, he soon made the mistake of kidnapping a young noblewoman who was revealed to be the cousin of none other than Karl Franz himself. Having sworn an oath to protect her, the army of the famed Grudgebringers delved into the vampire's mines, where they clashed with his undead hordes in a fierce battle. The Emperor's cousin was ultimately rescued, and Manfred himself was believed once more to be slain.